In the early 1860s, the nation tore itself apart in civil war, and the West pulled at people like a second chance. Some fled the draft, some chased wages, some followed rumors of land and minerals. Money moved too, looking for new markets and new resources while the East fought to survive. Out beyond the older states, the map looked wide and open. On the ground, it felt unfinished. Most frontier communities were not really towns yet. They were clusters of cabins, tents, corrals, and half-built streets that existed because stopping felt safer than traveling. Authority stayed unclear. A distant territorial office might have claimed control, but it rarely showed up in daily life. What mattered was who had food, who had tools, and who could be counted on. Survival first routines set the rules before anyone wrote them down. That uncertainty shaped everything. Work came before ideals, and order came after necessity. If a bridge washed out, people fixed it because trade depended on it. If theft spread, neighbors reacted because winter punished delay. There were no reliable courts, no steady police force, and no guarantee help arrived in time. The frontier did not run on freedom alone. It ran on improvisation, pressure, and constant calculation. Before officials showed up with seals and forms, settlers still needed predictability, so they made it. Land claims got marked, witnessed, and defended by common agreement, even when no courthouse existed to record them. A man could build, plant, and improve only if neighbors accepted his right to be there. That acceptance became a kind of currency. It turned empty space into owned ground and conflict into a problem the group had to manage. On the move, wagon trains ran like small governments. Rules set travel times, guard shifts, and how to handle theft or dangerous behavior because one person's choices could ruin everyone. The punishment usually aimed at survival, not drama. Warnings, restitution, exclusion. Churches and mutual aid groups carried the same idea into new settlements. They organized work parties, shared food in bad seasons, and tracked who repaid help. The message stayed simple. Community support required community discipline. Out of these habits came informal codes that acted like law without being law. Property meant more than possession. It meant recognized ownership. Work meant more than effort. It meant visible contribution, especially when everyone relied on everyone else. Reputation became enforcement. A person known for cutting corners paid for it later in higher prices, fewer partners, and colder help. By the time formal courts arrived, many disputes already followed local expectations. The paperwork merely hardened what people had already practiced. As more Americans moved west, Washington did not simply watch from a distance. It reached outward. The army built new forts in strategic places, not just to fight, but to hold ground, protect supply lines, and signal who claimed authority. Around those posts, traders and settlers adjusted their routes and their risks. A fort meant food contracts, patrols, and rules. It also meant the frontier started answering to federal decisions. Then came communication. Postal routes expanded across territories that still advertised themselves as open and self-made. Mail coaches followed schedules, not personal promises, and that changed behavior fast. A regular post connected remote towns to courts, banks, newspapers, and federal offices. It pulled the West into national time. It also created new choke points, stations to defend, roads to maintain, and officials to appoint. Independence stayed in the slogans, not the system. And the biggest step was planning the railroads before many places even felt settled. Federal survey teams mapped passes, measured rivers, and marked where future tracks could run. Those lines on paper decided which towns grew and which ones died. Land values shifted before a single spike was driven. The message was clear: The West looked wild, but it got organized in advance, by paperwork, by maps, and by power centered in Washington. As settlements grew into towns, arguing in the streets stopped being enough. People wanted decisions that held up tomorrow, not just tonight. So they hired sheriffs and town marshals, men paid to arrest someone instead of chasing them out. That sounded simple, but it changed everything. Force started answering to a payroll and an election. Justice stopped being a moment. It became a job. Once an officer existed, the town needed somewhere to bring the accused and someone to decide what to do next. Courts appeared, sometimes basic at first, but they carried weight because they produced records. Complaints turned into written charges, fines and fees followed, and money flowed through the process. The same act that once ended with a beating now ended with a bill. Procedure replaced impulse. Jails sealed the change. They held people in place long enough for law to work slowly, and that slowness created power. Sheriffs collected fees for serving papers and guarding prisoners, so arrests could pay. Judges and local officials depended on votes, friendships and favours, so outcomes could tilt. Vigilantism never vanished, but it had to compete with a system that looked calmer and often felt controlled. After the war years, the big money on the plains did not come from shootouts. It came from cattle. Ranchers raised huge herds on open range, where grass seemed endless and fences barely existed. But that freedom carried a problem. Animals wandered, brands looked alike, and one storm could mix everything together. So survival depended on shared rules, roundups, brand records, and agreements about whose cattle belonged to whom. The work fell to cowboys, hired for skill and endurance, not for violence. They drove herds for weeks toward railheads, new shipping towns where trains connected prairie beef to distant cities. That created a chain of trust. Ranchers needed reliable crews needed steady pay, rail agents needed predictable shipments. Contracts, time schedules, and clear ownership mattered more than bravado because a single mistake could ruin a season's profits. Conflicts still happened, but the incentives pushed in another direction. A gunfight stopped business and brought legal trouble, while cooperation kept cattle moving and money flowing. Informal cattlemen's associations formed to track brands, recover strays, and set basic standards for the trade. The West's most famous industry ran on paperwork and handshakes as much as on horses. The real order came from economics first, and violence became the costly exception. The cattle boom stayed alive only if herds reached buyers, and that meant railroads. Track companies decided where towns won and where they died, because a railhead could make a ranch valuable overnight. Rates and schedules looked like simple business, but they acted like rules. A rancher who missed a shipment lost cash, lost credit, and sometimes lost the season. The frontier still sounded free. It already ran on timetables set far away. As rail lines spread, banks followed. A bad winter, a drought, or a price drop turned into a meeting with a lender, not a showdown on Main Street. Notes came due, whether the grass returned or not. Small operators needed loans for land, wire, and cattle, so interest and collateral became the new pressure points. The bargain rarely felt equal. Money gathered in cities and moved west with conditions attached, and the risk stayed local. Then the big ranch outfits arrived, backed by investors and protected by scale. They bought up water access, leased enormous stretches, and used lawyers and agents to hold their ground. They could wait out hard years that ruined neighbors. They could influence shipping deals, local politics, even which brands got treated as respectable. The open range still looked wide, but power concentrated fast, and freedom depended on who controlled credit, transport, and the best land. The open range had worked only as long as nobody could cheaply control it. Then barbed wire arrived, a simple invention that changed everything. One man with a few posts could now claim what used to be shared grass and water. Homesteaders fenced to protect crops, big ranchers fenced to lock in advantage. The map did not change all at once, but it started breaking into hard, private pieces. Once fences spread, old agreements collapsed. Trails that cattle had followed for years got blocked. Water holes that kept herds alive sat behind wire. The fights that followed did not look like outlaw stories. They looked like business disputes with guns. Fence cutting became a weapon, and so did midnight construction crews racing to enclose land first. County offices and courts mattered because a piece of paper now decided whose fence stayed. Violence shifted too. It aimed less at strangers passing through and more at neighbours competing for control. Bigger outfits hired men, pushed sheriffs and used lawsuits when they could, force when they had to. Smaller ranchers and settlers fought back with sabotage and armed patrols, but they rarely matched money and connections. This turning point carved class power into the landscape. The West grew less open and more owned. By the late 1870s, Washington treated native land less like a home and more like an obstacle. Treaties that once sounded like permanent promises became moving targets, rewritten when gold, rail lines, or new farmland mattered more. Reservation borders shifted, hunting grounds shrank, and entire nations faced deadlines they never set. The language stayed formal, stamped and signed. The result stayed blunt. More land transferred, and native consent became a detail the system learned to work around. Federal policy then paired paperwork with force. The army enforced new boundaries, removed communities, and punished resistance as a criminal threat instead of a political dispute. Agents controlled food rations and supplies, and that control turned survival into leverage. Courts and officials framed the crackdown as public safety, as if order simply meant fewer fights. But the pattern kept repeating. When settlers wanted ground, enforcement arrived fast. When native nations demanded rights already written down, the process slowed, narrowed, or disappeared. This was how law and order changed meaning on the frontier. It sounded like fairness, rules, and protection, but it often worked like a delivery system for expansion. Land opened, claims multiplied, railroads and ranch outfits gained certainty, and towns grew richer from the flow. Native nations were left with less territory, fewer resources, and tighter supervision, all labelled as progress. Hollywood later sold the West as chaos tamed by brave lawmen. In practice, the biggest takings wore badges and federal seals. In the 1890s, officials announced that the frontier line no longer existed. The West on paper felt finished, maps filled in, counties tightened their borders, land offices, courts and agencies handled what used to be argued face to face. Rail schedules mattered more than trail instincts. Big companies tracked profits with ledgers, not rifles. A new order ran on permits, deeds and decisions made far away. But as the real West became more regulated, the public appetite for the Old West grew. Cheap dime novels turned messy lives into clean heroes. Buffalo Bill Cody's Wild West show toured cities and then crossed the Atlantic, selling a traveling version of frontier drama. It picked winners and villains fast. It simplified the past into quick scenes. Entertainment started exporting a West that never had to balance a budget. Then early movies took over because film made the myth feel like proof. A cowboy's silhouette said more than a land record ever could. The stories leaned on lone bravery and sudden violence, and they pushed paperwork out of the frame. Meanwhile, the real power sat with railroads, banks, and government offices that set terms and enforced them. The West did not vanish. It got managed and then rebranded. By the time the myth hardened, the real West had already changed again. Today, much of the land sat inside layers of regulation. Permits, leases, grazing rules, water rights, and federal oversight that decided what happened and who got paid. The old improvisation of neighbors settling disputes and setting expectations still mattered in memory, but it no longer drove outcomes. Authority moved upward. Decisions came from offices far away. That shift hit native nations hardest because sovereignty never became a closed chapter. Tribes kept fighting for land, water, and jurisdiction, often inside legal systems built without them and enforced around them. At the same time, extraction grew more technical and more profitable. Oil, gas, coal, timber, and minerals pulled out through corporate contracts that outweighed local voices. The West still promised freedom. It delivered paperwork and power imbalance. And then the story got sold back to the public as entertainment. Tourism leaned on the clean legend, endless space, personal grit, simple justice, because it moved tickets and filled hotels. That legend made consolidation feel natural, even patriotic, like progress that honored the past. But the early frontier's rough autonomy had been replaced by managed landscapes and concentrated ownership. The betrayal was not chaos turning civilized, it was control replacing choice, then being remembered as liberty.